Data is at the heart of every enterprise-level business application. Connecting to external APIs or databases in real time is essential for creating efficient, data-driven workflows. The data source component simplifies this process, allowing organizations to integrate data, automate tasks, and build dynamic applications effortlessly. That means that if your organization is looking to ensure standardization of how data is used within your apps, the data source component is a great tool to take advantage of. Whether it's populating choices for a select dropdown or pre-populating form fields from whatever system serves as your source of truth, the data source component delivers the data you expect from where you expect it. Let's dive into some examples. The data source component is added to a form using the drag and drop interface within the form builder. This component will be visible to the form designer but will remain hidden for end users filling out the form. Let's explore some of the settings. Use the Fetch tab to connect to external APIs or databases. Just plug in the endpoint to define the source of the data. The Trigger tab provides full control over when data is fetched, whether it's when a form loads, a user changes a field value, or clicks a button. After the trigger is active, the data source can also initiate its own trigger event, which typically activates logic applied to other fields within the form. Once the data source component fetches information from an external API or database, it stores this data as an object. The data can then be leveraged by other components in the form to perform complex calculations or logic. Let's explore some examples to see how the data source component simplifies workflows. It's important to note that these examples are using two separate endpoints connected to independent data silos. The first endpoint provides a list of US states along with their respective sales tax rates. The second endpoint connects to a database of orders containing various data points such as customer information and product details, all organized by an order ID. These examples also utilize checkboxes and buttons to activate the data source workflow. However, these components are not required and are included in the form solely for visual demonstration of how the data source component is triggered. In most cases, the application or server will handle these workflows programmatically. This first example demonstrates how to easily bind select drop-down options to live data fetched through the data source. This allows form designers to dynamically populate a drop-down menu with real-time information from an independent source. This can be achieved by setting the select drop-down data type to custom and referencing the fetch data using JavaScript. The data source is utilizing the state endpoint we reviewed earlier, binding the state name as my select drop-down value. Please note that the select component supports values from external sources without the need for a data source component. However, there are times when connecting the select component to a data source is beneficial. For example, if more than one component needs to use the same data set, connect these components to a single data source to prevent redundant API calls. If the API response needs to be filtered, mapped, or reformatted before being used, the data source provides a centralized place to transform the dataset. If a single component should dynamically switch between data sets, conditions can be put in place where the select will call upon different data sources based on user interaction on the form. Create intelligent forms by using calculated values which can automatically populate field data from external APIs or databases. Conditions can also be applied to customize the data being retrieved. In this example, the same data source endpoint is being used to populate US state tax rates. Based on the selected checkbox, the form can decide which specific information to utilize from the data source endpoint. Event-based updates make your forms dynamic. A button click can fetch information from the data source, trigger data calculations, and instantly update your form. In this example, the Retrieve Orders button triggers an event that the data source is listening for. Once the event is detected, the data source then fetches information from our second API endpoint containing our order information. It then triggers its own event, which activates calculated logic to populate the data within the edit grid. Easily filter the data being retrieved from the data source component. For example, the order ID dropdown can filter the orders populated in the grid and output information specific to that order ID. Integrate multiple data source components into your form to streamline workflows and simplify complex data connections. For example, our state dropdown is connected to the US state data source endpoint. It compares the connected state value against the order information endpoint, then finds the matching state and populates the state data into the dropdown field. The form then uses other data points from the order information endpoint, like the total cost of the order, and does some calculation against our tax rate endpoint to perform some complex interactions between our two different data silos. While these examples demonstrate a limited scope of data, it's clear how this component can benefit enterprise organizations that need to integrate large data sets from multiple API endpoints and databases into their forms and applications. Leverage the power of the data source component to create scalable, intelligent forms that make building data-driven applications faster, more efficient, and more user-friendly.